I remember the exact moment he said it, not because the words hurt, but because of how casually he dropped them. The new COO had been in the building for less than 3 hours. He still had the welcome badge clipped to his pocket. People were still complimenting his handshake, and yet at 9:07 a.m., he looked at the stack of reports on my desk, leaned back slightly, and said, "These are redundant. Not wrong, not inefficient, not outdated. Redundant. Like the 3 years I'd spent quietly untangling the vendor's mess were some sort of hobby I refused to give up. I didn't push back, not immediately. You don't survive long in corporate finance by arguing with someone who thinks they're here to streamline the machine. You watch, you listen, you measure the distance between their confidence and their understanding. And with him, the gap was wide. He had the resume, he had the rhetoric, but he didn't have context. Most people didn't know what my job actually was. They thought I checked invoices. That's what HR wrote in the description years ago. What I really did was find the errors the vendor insisted did not exist. Mismatched purchase orders, duplicated line items, misapplied discounts, accidental zeros, added by someone half asleep or half trained. Over time, the vendor started treating my corrections as part of the natural workflow. They'd send sloppy batches, I'd clean them, and no one asked questions. Except me. For months, I'd warned my old director that the system wasn't as automated as the vendor kept claiming. Errors weren't decreasing, they were shifting. Smaller mistakes disappearing, larger ones creeping in. Someone on their side had figured out that if you bury a bad adjustment inside a high-volume cycle, it gets lost unless someone like me manually cross-reconciles it. That someone was me. But now, apparently, that part was redundant. The COO flipped through one of my audit notebooks, one I'd spent weeks compiling to document flagged discrepancies. He skimmed 2 pages, closed it, and gave it back with a polite nod. "Good work," he said, "but we don't need this level of granularity. The vendors should handle their own errors." I didn't answer, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear the rest. He took my silence as compliance. "Let's sunset these," he added, tapping the folder. "If the vendor wants accountability, they can provide it. We don't need internal double checks. It slows things down." There it was, the phrase every seasoned analyst recognizes. Slows things down. Translation: I don't know how this works, but I want it simpler so I feel in control. I asked one question because it was the only one that mattered. Do you want me to stop the reconciliations immediately or finish this cycle first? He didn't hesitate. Immediately. I'll take responsibility for the transition. That last line wasn't confidence. It was arrogance disguised as ownership, but it was also exactly what I needed. I typed up a summary of his directive while he stood by my desk, handed him the memo, and watched him sign it. He didn't even read the full text, just scanned for keywords, signed, and walked away. The room didn't feel hostile. It felt strangely calm. I'd been preparing for something like this for months, not because I wanted it, but because I knew someone, eventually, would get ambitious enough to think the vendor's automation pitch was real. I saved the signed memo, time-stamped the file, and removed myself from the reconciliation workflow. No backdoor checks, no silent fixes, no last-minute catches. I did exactly what he asked. That afternoon felt empty. Not in a sad way, but in a quiet, anticipatory way, like the silence before a storm that only you can smell in the air. Because here's the thing, nobody tells new executives. You can ignore a process. You can ignore a person. You can ignore a warning. But financial systems, they don't ignore anything. By the next morning, the first discrepancy appeared, and that was only the beginning. The first discrepancy showed up at 8:42 a.m. the next day. A small one, almost invisible. The kind of error only someone who's spent years inside a system can feel, not see. I was reviewing tickets in the shared queue, trying to stay out of the mess I'd just been removed from, when I noticed a tiny shift in the vendor's batch summary. Nothing dramatic. A value that should have been 0.euros suddenly wasn't. Not enough to raise alarms. Just enough to tell me something upstream had changed. I didn't say a word. The COO wanted the vendor to own their numbers, so I let them. By noon, 5 more discrepancies appeared. All of them small. All of them predictable. Without my reconciliations, the system didn't fall apart instantly. It drifted, slowly, quietly, in the same direction every time, a direction I'd been manually correcting for months. At 2:17 p.m., my former director, the one who understood how fragile the vendor integration was, walked over to my desk. He didn't sit down. He didn't smile. He just asked, "You didn't touch any of the batches today, right?" "No," I said. "COO's directive." He nodded slowly, the way someone does when a fear they've lived with finally proves itself true. "All right, keep it that way." But that wasn't the moment everything turned. That moment came 2 hours later. At 4:28 p.m., I heard a voice echo from the COO's office, the vendor manager, a woman named Michelle who'd worked with us for years. She spoke calmly, professionally, but even from across the room, I could hear the strain tightening the edges of her voice. "No, that adjustment didn't come from us," she said. "No, those numbers were clean on our end. If they changed internally, your team needs to check the workflow." It wasn't anger, it was confusion. The kind people feel when a system that hasn't broken in years suddenly starts slipping on basic arithmetic. I stayed out of it. Completely. But inside, irritation was building. Not because the system drifted, but because everyone acted surprised. They'd been warned, repeatedly, quietly, professionally. Every anomaly, every inconsistency, every flagged correction, I documented them all. And the COO had dismissed the entire structure in one morning. At 5:03 p.m., he finally came to my desk. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the signed directive. He simply asked the one question executives ask when they realize they might have underestimated the complexity of a system. "Did anything unusual happen in yesterday's cycle?" I looked him in the eye. "You asked me to stop reconciling. So I stopped. That's the only change." He held my gaze a second too long, not angrily, analytically, like he was trying to decide whether I was being passive-aggressive or simply stating a fact. It didn't matter, because the next question told me everything. "Can you take a quick look at this batch? Just a quick one." Off the record. There it was, the first crack in his confidence. I shook my head, calmly. "I can't. Not without reversing your directive. You said the vendor owns their numbers now." His jaw tightened, not because I refused, but because I reminded him of his own words. "I'll handle it," he muttered and walked back. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I left the building on time. No late checks, no quiet corrections, no saving the system from itself. And as I walked to my car, a thought hit me. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just brutally honest. They weren't prepared for what I'd been protecting them from. By the next morning, the discrepancies wouldn't be small anymore. And I didn't know it yet, but this was the day everything would start sliding out of their hands. Fast. By the third morning, the system wasn't drifting anymore. It was slipping. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to make every department uncomfortable, without knowing why. At 9:14 a.m., an alert popped up in the finance channel, the kind we almost never saw. Batch 47 requires secondary validation. Secondary validation wasn't a real requirement. It was a placeholder flag. A silent alarm built years ago by an engineer who probably never imagined anyone would rely on it. It only triggered when the numbers coming from the vendor contradicted the internal ledger by more than a safe margin, a margin I used to correct manually. I wasn't part of that workflow anymore, so the flag stayed red. 2 minutes later, another alert, then another. A chain reaction, small errors colliding with slightly bigger ones, all feeding into the quarterly expense cycle. Finance analysts started pinging each other. Procurement asked if someone had updated the discount matrix. AP blamed a system timing issue. Nobody blamed the vendor, not yet. At 9:31, I heard the first sign that the COO was starting to panic, the sound of his office door closing. Executives don't close doors unless something's wrong. Inside, voices rose, calm tones trying to stay calm. Michelle, the vendor manager, repeating the same phrase over and over. Our records don't show these changes. Not defensive, just factual. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger, not vindication, just realization. For months I had been patching leaks, quietly, automatically, without asking anyone for permission. I had convinced myself I was protecting the team, protecting the company, keeping the system running the way it should. It took exactly 2 days without my fixes for me to see the truth. I hadn't been protecting them. I'd been enabling them. The vendor wasn't improving because I never forced them to. The leadership never saw the risk because I absorbed it. The system never broke because I held it together with invisible stitches, and now those stitches were gone. At 10:12 a.m., the COO stepped out of his office, face tight, shoulders stiff, pretending nothing was wrong. But I'd worked long enough in corporate to recognize the look of someone who'd just been told something expensive. He walked straight toward me. Can you explain why the discount reconciliation is out of range? He asked. Not, can you help me understand? Not, we're seeing an anomaly. A direct question, with an implicit accusation buried inside. I answered plainly. I didn't touch the cycle, per your directive. He swallowed that, hard. Then he tried again. Look, can you walk me through what you used to do? Just high level. I did. Every step. No embellishment, no bitterness, just the truth. The vendor system wasn't built for nuance. It needed oversight. Real oversight, consistent oversight. By the time I finished, he wasn't angry. He was pale. Because suddenly the discrepancies weren't minor anymore. They were accumulating. At 11:03, procurement discovered a $142,000 adjustment that shouldn't exist. At 11:17, accounting flagged mismatched tax tables. At 11:26, AP found duplicated payments, small ones, scattered but too consistent to ignore. Every issue led to another. Every audit trail had gaps. Every automated fix the vendor claimed to handle wasn't fixing anything. The COO tried to hold it together, but his voice kept tightening each time someone approached him with a new problem. I watched him pace between offices, phone pressed to his ear, hand on his forehead like he was trying to push the math back into place through sheer force of will. But numbers don't negotiate, and mistakes don't stay small when they stack. By 12:40 p.m., 3 departments were involved. By 1:10 p.m., finance escalated it to a cross-functional review. By 1:35 p.m., the COO had to admit, at least internally, something was wrong at system level, and that was when I felt the crack inside me widen into something bigger, not directed at him, not even at the company, but at myself. For the first time, I wasn't shocked by the chaos. I wasn't frustrated. I wasn't rushing to fix anything. I was realizing a deeper truth. Systems reveal character. His character relied on simplification. Mine relied on responsibility. And the vendor? Their character relied on someone else catching their mistakes. Without me, all 3 were exposed. At 2:02 p.m., the COO sent a message to the team channel. We need full documentation on previous reconciliation processes. Immediately. He didn't tag me, because tagging me would mean admitting I had been right. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. What mattered was what I saw when I opened the day's final batch. Not a mistake, not a drift, a pattern, a deliberate pattern. Someone, somewhere inside the vendor's workflow, wasn't making random errors. They were covering something, and by the time anyone else noticed, it would be too late to pretend it was an accident. Everything was sliding, fast, and nobody understood how deep it went. Yet, by the 4th morning, the system wasn't slipping anymore. It was breaking, not all at once. Breakages never happen as one dramatic explosion. They happen as a sequence, one failure feeding another, one minor anomaly turning into a structural collapse. At 8:07 a.m., procurement flagged a $312,000 discrepancy. At 8:19, AP found a batch rerouted to a shadow cost center. At 8:26, accounting discovered 3 invoices pushed through without matching purchase orders. These weren't random mistakes. They were coordinated. You don't see that pattern unless you've spent months tracing the invisible seams of a sloppy vendor system. You don't see how someone hides large adjustments inside high-volume days unless you've caught them doing it before. The COO hadn't. Neither had anyone he trusted. At 8:42, he called an emergency meeting. He didn't invite me, but I didn't need an invitation. The walls in that conference room weren't soundproof, and the tone of a panicked executive carries farther than they think. Michelle, the vendor manager, was the first to speak. "Your internal checks should have flagged this," she said, not realizing the irony. The COO's answer came sharp and defensive. "We removed redundant processes based on your automation roadmap." Michelle didn't blink. "Our automation never replaced manual reconciliation. We've said that in every quarterly review." Silence. Heavy. Ugly. Because there it was. The truth he didn't want to hear. He had cut the only layer keeping the system intact. At 9:14 a.m., everything snapped. I heard the notification before I saw the screen. A full system freeze warning. Not a soft alert. Not a yellow flag. A stop-the-line red banner across the finance dashboard. Critical exception: vendor adjustments exceed threshold. Threshold wasn't a suggestion. It was a failsafe built years ago to catch mass manipulation. I opened the logs, and the truth hit me like a fist. The vendor hadn't just been sloppy. They'd been hiding adjustments, large ones, behind my reconciliations. Adjustments I unknowingly cleaned every month. And now, without me, they stacked, one on top of another, layer after layer, until the system couldn't pretend anymore. At 9:22, the COO stormed out of the conference room and went straight to my desk. No greeting, no pretense. "I need you in the review room, now." I didn't move. "You removed me from that process," I said calmly. "You signed the memo." He closed his eyes for a second, not in anger, but in something closer to dread. "This isn't the time for blame." "It's not blame," I replied. "It's documentation." For a moment, I thought he was going to lose his temper, but he didn't. He swallowed it. Hard. "Please," he said, "we're past the point of quick fixes." That wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he could manage. So I stood up and followed him. Inside the review room, the atmosphere was electric with panic. Procurement, accounting, AP. Everyone crowded around the screen. Michelle was scrolling through error logs with shaking hands. Then she said the words that shifted the room's temperature. "This isn't a glitch. These are manual adjustments. Not automated, not accidental. Manual." The COO leaned over her shoulder. "From your side or ours?" Michelle didn't defend her team. She didn't raise her voice. She just clicked one button. The audit trail filter. A list populated instantly. Every single adjustment that caused the system to break came from one vendor employee. I recognized the username, because 6 months ago I'd flagged patterns under the same name. Suspicious rounding, repeated discount misapplications, staged as fat finger errors, but always trending upward. I had warned my old director. He had documented the warning. And the CO? He had never read that file. Michelle spoke again, more quietly now. "If these adjustments hit final processing, the correction fee from our side could be substantial." "How substantial?" the COO asked, voice barely controlled. Michelle typed a calculation. The room went dead still. 7.9 million. Nobody breathed, because now it wasn't about system errors. It wasn't about workflow efficiency. It wasn't even about blame. It was about liability, about contracts, about who pays. The COO finally turned to me. pale, sweating, realizing, maybe for the first time, the scale of what he had dismantled. What do we do? Not, can you fix this? Not help me. Just a raw question from someone standing on unstable ground. I took a breath, and something inside me settled. A clarity I hadn't felt in years. We don't do anything, I said. We document. That's all. Every step, every signature, every directive, every recommendation. You'll need it for the escalation. He blinked. Escalation to who? I looked at the screen at the 7.9 estimate glowing red. To legal, to finance, to the vendor's compliance team. Then I added, because it was the truth. And to the board. For a second, the weight of that landed on him so hard he actually sat down. The system was broken. The truth was exposed. The damage was real. And the avalanche he started with one word, redundant, was finally coming back down the mountain. But the real reckoning, that hadn't even started yet. Because Part 5 wasn't about chaos anymore. It was about consequences. The board meeting wasn't dramatic. Corporate myths love to paint these moments as shouting matches, people pointing fingers, executives breaking down. Reality is quieter, sharper, more dangerous. By the time the COO presented the escalation packet, the full documentation, the audit logs, the vendor trail, the 7.9-man liability projection, the board already had the numbers. You don't surprise a board with 8-figure exposure. They get briefed before the meeting even begins. I wasn't in the boardroom. I wasn't supposed to be. But I didn't need to be physically present to understand exactly how the conversation unfolded. I'd seen it before. Different companies, different leaders, same script. A leader makes a sweeping decision, cuts a process he doesn't understand, dismisses expertise he never bothered to evaluate. And when the system collapses, he learns the most expensive lesson in corporate governance. Authority without comprehension is negligence. The meeting lasted 46 minutes. Not long, not short. Just enough time for the board to walk through the audit trail, one document at a time, including the memo he signed with my summary of his directive. His signature, his timestamp, his approval, every consequence flowed directly from that. At 11:58 a.m., the COO stepped out of the boardroom looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in under an hour. His tie was slightly crooked, not dramatically, just enough to show his mind had been somewhere else. He walked into the review room, where Michelle, my old director, and a few others were gathered. I stayed at my desk, not out of distance, but out of respect for the process. This wasn't my moment. It was his. He looked around the room, took a breath, and said something I wasn't expecting. Not because he didn't owe it, but because executives rarely say it. This one's on me. No excuses, no deflection. Just the truth, stated plainly. Then he added, and I should have listened. It wasn't said to me directly. It didn't need to be. The words themselves mattered less than the fact he'd learned the weight of what he'd dismissed. But the real consequence came half an hour later. At 12:34 p.m., legal sent the notification. Effective immediately, vendor operations are suspended. Formal review initiated. And 8 minutes after that, vendor notified of preliminary correction assessment, 7 Moimbi. The vendor's compliance team called Michelle in a panic. Their senior director flew in the next morning. Their internal logs confirmed it. One employee had been manipulating adjustments for months, hiding them behind my reconciliations, confident nobody would track them. He was terminated within 24 hours. The vendor absorbed the fee without argument. They couldn't afford to push back. The audit trail was airtight. As for the COO, the board didn't fire him. Corporate rarely fires a high-level executive over one mistake, even an expensive one. It sends the wrong message to investors, creates instability, and invites scrutiny. What they did do was worse and far more realistic. They stripped him of operational authority, moved him into a strategic role, a title with no power, no influence, and no real responsibilities. The kind of role companies create when they want someone to stay, quietly, until they choose to leave on their own. He wasn't a villain, just a man who believed confidence replaced comprehension. And in corporate systems, that belief costs millions. Around 3 p.m., when the dust finally settled, my old director walked over and set a folder on my desk. "You kept this place together longer than anyone knew," he said. "They see that now." The folder contained a revised job description. My job, restored, upgraded, rewritten with the accuracy it should have had years ago. A new title, a raise, full authority over vendor reconciliation oversight. Not because they were rewarding me, but because they finally understood the value of what they almost removed. For the first time since all of this began, I felt something strange. Not vindication, not pride, just peace. Because the truth is, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want the COO humiliated. I didn't want chaos. All I ever wanted was for someone to listen when the numbers told a story. And numbers always tell the truth. Eventually. That evening, as I shut down my computer and walked toward the elevator, I opened the memo he'd signed on day one. The one where he'd written, with full confidence, "Vendor owns their numbers." I saved it again, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as a reminder. Systems don't break suddenly. People break them slowly, through ego, shortcuts, and the belief that experience is optional. But someone always sees the cracks. And if they step away, even for one cycle, everything that happens after isn't a fight. It's repayment. And in this case, $7.9 million worth of it.